Divine presence in the life of the Christian believer. Rowe, in his Philosophy of Religion and Introduction, in his chapter on religious and mystical experience, states that a religious experience is an experience in which one senses the immediate presence of the divine. While discussions could be had regarding whether one should seek the divine presence through mystical experiences or understand it from a non-mystical framework, other questions arise from Rowe's definition. First, what is meant exactly by divine presence? Second, how is the idea of divine presence to be incorporated into the lives of Christians? This paper shall seek to provide some answers to these two questions. The conclusion reached through these examinations is that God's presence should impact the life of the believer, not just in theory, but in attitude and practice. In simplest terminology, divine presence is to be understood as the immediate presence of a divine being. Further exploration of this idea will provide a basis for which discussion can occur. One foundational topic that requires study is that of the omnipresence of God. Hudson, in his chapter on the omnipresence of God in the Oxford Handbook of Philosophical Theology, provides a thorough overview of the discussion of omnipotence. Essentially, there are two main ways to understand omnipotence. Hudson first examines the non-occupational view, pulling from the writings of Aquinas and Anselm, as well as more modern writers such as Waringa, Swinburne, and Hartshorne. He summarizes one of this view's most compelling motivations in that non-occupation accounts permit an adherence to the incorporeality of God untroubled by qualifications and partial concessions. Now, in regard to a literal occupation account of God's omnipresence, Hudson addresses the 6 problems that arise from such a view. The problems of simplicity, multilocation, containment, timelessness, incorporeality, and collocation. He contends that the theory of intention adequately satisfies the question that arises from a literal occupation view. Intention is the idea that an object is located at some non-point sized region, in the case of omnipresence, at the maximally inclusive region, to be wholly located at each of that region's proper subregions, in the case of omnipresence, at every other region there is. He concludes that there might be some further questions that arise from the intention theory, but that it best supports the common understanding of presence as being located at somewhere. For Anselm and Aquinas, the omnipresence of God was derived from either his knowledge, according to Anselm, or his power, Aquinas. For Hudson and others who support it, the intention theory provides a way for understanding God's omnipresence as being an essential attribute rather than it being derived from one of his other attributes. Since it is ascertained that it is possible for God to be omnipresent, he is understood to be everywhere present at every time. The working definition that this paper uses, though, is that divine presence is the immediate presence of a divine being. Now, a second topic that needs to be explored is the concept of immanence of God, that is, that God is near. The question arises, though, regarding how a transcendent God can be immanent. Kim writes that there are 2 possible senses in which this can be done. First, a transcendent being could implant the idea of itself into the mind of a created being. Second, the transcendent being could share its nature with the creature. He goes on to say that the locus of divine immanence in each of these senses must be a subject, not a mere object or substance. Burns echoes this when he states that God's presence signifies that he is with his creation, generally omnipresence, and with his people intimately, immanence. Now, what then does this immediate near presence mean? Holmes writes that the presence can have but little meaning if it does not mean freedom of direct or immediate communication. In other words, following Kim's second sense of immanence, God has personally shared his presence with humanity. Now, for this relationship to exist, it is necessary to understand how God makes his immanence known, since it often seems that God is not present. Burnett observes in regards to the question of where is God, that 1, as presented in the Bible, divine absence has always raised an explicit relationship with the individual, group, or the particular people or nation associated with the deity. 2, the question was not limited to ancient Israel, as seen in various West Semitic and Akkadian personal names, as well as belonging to the common religious heritage of the Near East. And then 3, the question shows how divine human relationships are conceived of in spatial terms. So how does God communicate his presence? One way of this communication is that of theophany. Theophany is to be understood as a visitation of actual meeting between human and divine. Biblically, the 3 terms used to convey these experiences in relation to God's presence are malak, kavod, and panim, a messenger, his visible glory, and his face. It is from these encounters that it is from these encounters with God that another method arose by which humanity can meet God. Holmes notes, our faith that God, immanent and transcendent, has spoken is crowned by the faith that God is speaking and will speak. Or in other words, that the Supreme Personality is still making himself known to persons. Here we have one of the great uses of the Bible for ourselves. It is one of the chief means by which God, really present, speaks now to men. It is not to be used only as a record of what he has said in the past. It is the instrument through which he speaks with a living voice today. Though through it we may be assured of the existence of God, not by inference only, but by experience. The Bible thus becomes alike the instrument and the revealer of the real presence of God. What Holmes calls the real presence is to be understood as the concept of the incarnation, the idea that God has made himself known by becoming part of his creation, the ultimate immanence through self-incarnation. Ontologically speaking, this presents a paradox, as Kim asserts. In becoming incarnate and assuming forms of created being, the deity becomes for itself a being other than itself. The incarnating God is identical with, and at the same time different from, the incarnated God. The eternal, infinite, non-corporeal being is, and simultaneously is not, temporal, finite, and corporeal. He goes on to point to Hegel's dialectic approach as the best interpretational method for understanding the incarnation, though there are those who disagree, namely Kierkegaard. Young points out that for Hegel, dialectic is not rational thought conformed to the understanding. Thought itself is irrational, i.e., above the understanding, because it is living. Hegel's philosophy is not only a philosophy of identity, but also a philosophy of contradiction, and that in it the contradiction acquires a methodological significance and becomes a means of knowledge. Now, divine presence as a concept can be summed up in two ways. First, God is omnipotent. He is everywhere, omniscient. He is everywhere, every time. This can be understood as God's general presence. Second, God is immanent. This means that God's presence goes beyond the general and becomes personal, as immanence involves a relationship, as has been shown above. This immanence is revealed through theophany, revelation, and incarnation. Now, having reviewed those topics in the abstract, it is necessary to bring them into a more concrete form. Now, this paper will turn to explore some biblical passages that point to God's omnipresence, his immanence, as well as the recorded promises of his presence. A cursory survey of Old Testament and New Testament passages is necessary in this regard due to this author's understanding that this philosophical inquiry is an engagement in faith-seeking understanding, as Anselm nearly named his work Proslogium. As such, any study of such a nature needs to found itself in the teachings of that faith, and for the Christian, those teachings are found in the Bible. Passages that speak of Christ and the Holy Spirit being in the believer will be explored as well, taking as a foundation the Christian teaching that God exists as Trinity. Now, in regard to omnipresence, there are several verses that support that the God of the Bible professes this attribute. Jeremiah 23:24 reads, "Can a man hide himself in hiding places so I do not see him, declares the Lord? Do I not fill the heavens and the earth?" Solomon, in his prayer at the dedication of the temple, recorded in 1 Kings 8:27, states, "But will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house which I have built?" Boschman has it that this verse points out the boundlessness of God's presence and that God fills all with his presence. Perhaps the clearest passage that points to God's omnipresence is found in Psalm 139, 7-11. "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me." The psalmist highlights that God's presence is to be found everywhere, from the heights of the heavens to the underworld and beyond. Omnipresence, according to Scripture, is a key attribute of God. Now, as to God's immanence, a brief treatment will first be given to several instances in the Old Testament where God makes himself known through theophany, followed by several passages that point out the ultimate in immanence, the incarnation. One passage will be used to highlight each of the three terms that Savron highlights are used in the Old Testament regarding God's presence. First, Savron notes that malak can be messenger, representation, advance party, or in one case, a term for a fiery manifestation of the divine, Exodus 3:2. One instance of where the malak of God appears is in 1 Kings 19, 1-8, where Elijah flees from Jezebel, and an angel of the Lord touches him and speaks to him twice. This messenger brings instruction and nourishment to Elijah, and there is both physical touch and speech, both forms of communication signifying presence. Now, in regard to kavod, Savron writes that this can refer to a publicly discernible presence which is visible to all Israel at certain moments. In Exodus 16:10, it is recorded that it came about as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the sons of Israel that they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. This was done to show the people of Israel that God had heard his people and he was present with them. As to the third term, panim, Savron notes its wide range of meaning. It implies something like presence, but this can vary from a metonymic form for a term for the entire deity, a description of divine attentiveness, a sort of source of blessing, or a cultic meaning perhaps connected with pilgrimage. Now, this term, Savron observes, is used only once for a theophany narrative in Exodus 33, 17-23, where it is used in conjunction with kavod. Moses asks to see God's glory, kavod, but God responds that Moses could not look upon his face, panim, and live. Instead, Moses could look upon God's back. The idea behind this is that God's presence is not something to be taken casually, as Burns notes. Now, as to the incarnation, when Christians speak of it, it is held that the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, took on flesh, becoming Jesus Christ. There are several passages that have this as their teaching. John 1:14 states, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth." Jesus himself proclaims his deity when he states in John 10:30, "I and the Father are one." Paul records one of the earliest Christian hymns in Philippians 2:5-11, wherein Christ is said to have existed in the form of God, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a bondservant. Essentially, Christ was equal to God and thus God himself, but chose to forego his glory and take on flesh. In Christianity, divine presence is not limited to those events that are recorded in the Old Testament, nor is it limited to the time when Christ, God incarnate, dwelled on the earth. Instead, Scripture asserts that God is present with and in the believer even today. Perhaps the most well-known promise of his presence is found at the end of the Great Commission, found in Matthew 28:18-20, where Jesus promises, "I am with you always, even to the end of the age." The author of Hebrews references both Deuteronomy 31:6 and Joshua 1:5 when he states that God says, "I will never desert you, nor will I forsake you," Hebrews 13:5. God has promised his presence with and alongside of believers. God has also promised his presence in believers. John records Jesus as saying in John 14:20 and 23, "In that day you will know that I am in the Father, and you in me, and I in you. And we will come to him and make our abode with him." Later in John 17:22-23, it reads, "The glory which you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one, just as we are one, I in them, and you in me." Paul, in giving an admonition and exhortation to his Corinthian readers, points to Christ's indwelling when he asks them, "Or do you not recognize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless you fail the test?" 2 Corinthians 13:5. There are many more passages that could be used to point to the fact of Christ and the Spirit's indwelling of believers. Philosophy, etymologically, is a love of wisdom. Wisdom, according to its scriptural usage, refers to a way of life or rightly living out what is properly understood, as opposed to foolishness. In speaking of the wisdom literature that is found in the scriptures, Wood writes that it is nothing less than one of God's means for preparing man to live in accordance with the divine will. Thus, philosophy, in this author's view, is a means to properly understand a concept and then apply it to one's life. In this case, the question becomes, how does one incorporate into one's worldview and lifestyle the concept of divine presence, specifically the teaching of the indwelling presence of God? This paper shall briefly look at two areas where this concept should impact the life of the Christian believer. The first is in regard to the believer's understanding of his or her relationship with God. The second is during times of suffering, trial, and or tribulation in which the Christian may find him or herself. What does the indwelling presence of God mean about the believer's relationship with God? As has already been noted in this paper, presence conveys the idea of relationship. Burns notes that presence connotes relationship, and a relationship with God involves a commitment, usually a lifetime, of faithfulness and loyalty. Holmes echoes this when he writes, "It follows that the presence recognized, welcomed, and loved implies continuous discipleship, a process of learning which never ceases." Brother Lawrence remarked that we must give ourselves totally to God. Peter in 2 Peter writes that Christians become partakers of the divine nature, 2 Peter 1:4. This ties in nicely with Kim's second sense of imminence mentioned above. The indwelling presence of God, given the context of the rest of 2 Peter 1, empowers the believer to live the Christian life based in this relationship with Jesus Christ. Relationship and presence are intertwined together. For the believer, this means that the presence of God signifies that the relationship is there and that his presence is constant. A second area where the presence of God has an impact on the life of the believer is during times of suffering. Hebrews 13:5 was previously mentioned, wherein God promises not to leave nor forsake the believer. This includes during times of suffering, tribulation, trial, and persecution. Romans 8:26 teaches that the Spirit, who the believer has received, according to verse 15, and who indwells the believer, intercedes on the believer's behalf during times of suffering. The believer can rest assured that God is right there with him through times of suffering. These two areas are by no means the only areas in the life of the believer wherein the believer is affected by God's presence. These were chosen to highlight the fact that God's presence should indeed have an impact on the believer. God's presence serves as a reminder to constant discipleship, relationship with Him, and provides comfort and the ability to endure during times of tribulation. The task for the Christian is not so much to seek out the presence of God, but rather acknowledge His presence and to live life in light of it. This involves trusting in Him, seeking His will through His Word, and remembering that the God of the universe, transcendent, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, is not just near to His children, but dwelling with and in them, transforming them into His image, 2 Corinthians 3:18. This will be seen not just in how the believer thinks, but in how he lives out his life. For the Christian life should look more and more like Christ as the believer matures spiritually, reflecting, as Paul puts it in Ephesians 5:8, goodness, righteousness, and truth. Now, this study of the divine presence is a move from abstract to concrete, from philosophical to practical. The topic of God's presence is one with many avenues to explore, and the length of this paper does not allow for the depth necessary for a fuller understanding. Hopefully, though, it serves as an introduction to the subject. With the idea being that understanding should lead to action, this paper proposes that the concept of God's immediate presence should be incorporated not just into the thought life, but the actual life of the believer.